It was a golden morning in the city, a day that should have been full of promise, as sunlight streamed over neatly manicured lawns and sleek luxury cars. Yet, for Jason Wellington, heir to the vast Wellington Industries empire, it was anything but promising. Jason sat in his father's office, hands in his pockets, shoulders slouched, his head tilted back to rest against the chair. Across the grand mahogany desk sat Mr. Wellington himself, the man who had built their wealth from scratch, and now, at 62, had neither the patience nor the kindness to watch his only son squander everything. "I've had enough, Jason." His father's voice was sharp, like the edge of the crystal glass from which he had poured his morning scotch. Jason's lazy smirk slipped away at the sheer anger in his father's words. "Enough of what?" Jason asked, straightening up. He wasn't entirely surprised by his father's disappointment. It had become an emotion as familiar as air in their household. "Enough of your irresponsibility. Enough of the partying, the meaningless friends, and those escapades that land you on every tabloid cover. I run a multi-billion-dollar empire, and you're out there playing a fool." Mr. Wellington slammed his fist on the desk, rattling the family crest, a silver emblem that symbolized old money and expectations. "I'm living my life, Dad. Isn't that what you've always wanted? For me to enjoy all these privileges?" His father's eyes narrowed to slits, the room falling into an awkward silence. Jason swallowed. He could tell something drastic was coming. Mr. Wellington wasn't the kind of man to just yell. He had a knack for taking actions that would force others to fall in line. "I have tried giving you freedom," his father said, his voice suddenly calm, though the tension was still there. "Now I'm giving you something different, something you cannot walk away from." He leaned forward, an unfamiliar spark in his eyes. Jason frowned, shifting in his seat. "What are you talking about?" "You're getting married, Jason," his father said, his lips curling into an oddly satisfied smile. "It's time to grow up and accept some responsibilities, and perhaps a good wife will help you get on the right track." Jason's jaw dropped, and a laugh of disbelief escaped his lips. "What? You're kidding, right?" "I'm not. You can't keep disrespecting our name without consequences," Mr. Wellington stated. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, staring out at the sweeping view of the city. "I've already found someone. You will marry her, and that's final." "Found someone?" Jason's voice cracked, his eyes widening. "You can't just—" "I can, and I will. There are no negotiations, Jason." Mr. Wellington turned to him, his gaze like ice. "Tonight, I will speak with her family. You have no say in the matter." Jason's mind reeled. His pulse thundered in his ears, and a wave of helpless anger surged through him. This wasn't something he could talk or charm his way out of. His father had that look, the one that meant his mind was made up. There would be no arguments, no plea that could change his decision. On the other side of town, in a modest but neat apartment, Leah Morrison was having a vastly different sort of morning. She stood at the sink, scrubbing dishes with quick, efficient movements while her mother bustled behind her, preparing breakfast. Leah's father, a middle management accountant at a local firm, sat at the table, looking at the bills that seemed to grow longer each month. "Leah, did you make sure to send out that last application?" her mother asked, flipping a pancake onto a platter. "Yes, Mom," Leah sighed, her tone edged with resignation. "But you know it's not likely they'll get back to me anytime soon." Her mother paused and smiled sympathetically. "I know it's frustrating, dear, but keep trying. You'll land the right job soon enough." Leah forced a smile. She'd heard that so many times over the past few months that it had lost all meaning. She wanted to help, to lessen the financial burden on her parents, but it seemed the world was set against her. She was smart, she had graduated college with good grades, but jobs weren't easy to come by. Not in the current market, at least. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, loud and persistent. Leah dried her hands on her apron, her brow furrowing. "I'll get it," she called. When she opened the door, Leah was startled to find a man in a crisp, dark suit, standing stiffly with a smile that looked entirely forced. Behind him, a sleek black car gleamed under the sun. "Miss Leah Morrison?" he asked, his eyes darting towards her father, who had appeared behind her. "Yes?" Leah exchanged glances with her father, who moved closer protectively. The man extended a business card, the Wellington family emblem embossed in silver on its surface. "My name is Thomas. I am the assistant to Mr. Wellington. He would like to speak with your family. Today." if it's convenient. Mr. Morrison blinked, glancing from the card to the man. The Wellingtons? You mean Wellington Industries? Yes, sir. Thomas smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. Mr. Wellington wishes to discuss a matter of great importance. It concerns a proposition regarding Miss Leah. Leah looked at her father, then back at the man. Her stomach churned with unease. What could someone as wealthy and powerful as Mr. Wellington possibly want with their family? Well, her father stammered, clearly caught off guard. Of course, please come in. Thomas stepped inside, and Leah couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. Something was about to change, something she couldn't control. Asterisk, asterisk. The Morrison family gathered around the dining table, Thomas sitting across from them. The assistant's demeanor was courteous but rigid, his tone almost rehearsed as he laid out the purpose of his visit. My employer, Mr. Wellington, is interested in arranging a marriage between his son and your daughter. The words hung in the air as the Morrisons tried to make sense of what they had just heard. Leah's mother gasped softly, her eyes widening. Her father rubbed his temples as if trying to dispel a headache that had suddenly begun to throb. Leah herself felt her world teeter. Excuse me? She managed to choke out, her voice barely a whisper. Thomas continued as if her shock were nothing out of the ordinary. Mr. Wellington believes that such an arrangement would be beneficial to both families. Your daughter would marry Jason Wellington, and in return, the Wellingtons would provide financial security and support for your family. The room fell into stunned silence. Leah's father cleared his throat, his gaze darting to Leah, who sat there, her expression somewhere between disbelief and fear. This is highly unusual. I mean, why Leah? Thomas smiled, tilting his head. Mr. Wellington believes your daughter possesses certain qualities that could complement his son. Besides, he is seeking a suitable match, and it seemed that your family might find this offer compelling. He said it politely, but the implication was clear. They knew the Morrisons struggled financially, and they were dangling a golden carrot in front of them, an offer that most would find impossible to refuse. Leah looked at her parents, her voice trembling as she spoke. Dad, Mom, I can't. You can't agree to this. Mr. Morrison's expression was pained. He knew Leah had dreams, and he had always wanted her to be free to pursue them, but the weight of financial burdens was something he couldn't ignore. He glanced at his wife, who was staring down at her hands, her lips pressed into a thin line. This is a lot to take in, Mr. Morrison said, trying to buy time. We need to discuss this as a family? Of course, Thomas said, his smile never faltering. He rose from the table, buttoning his jacket. But Mr. Wellington expects a response soon. He is quite insistent. I will leave my card here. Please contact me within the next 24 hours. Leah wanted to scream, to tell him to leave and never come back. But her parents' silence told her everything she needed to know. She knew they were considering it, and a part of her understood why. It made her heart break. As Thomas left, Leah felt tears sting her eyes. Her mother placed a trembling hand on hers. We just need to think about this, Leah, she whispered, her voice shaky. There is nothing to think about, Leah snapped, standing up so fast her chair nearly toppled over. I can't marry a stranger just because they have money. Her father sighed deeply, rubbing his tired eyes. We will talk about it, Leah. Just give us some time. Leah turned and walked quickly out of the room, her heart pounding. She needed air. She needed to think. How could her life have changed so drastically in a matter of minutes? Asterisk, asterisk. Later that night, the decision was made. Leah sat at the kitchen table, her eyes red from crying. Her father looked at her with an expression of regret and helplessness. We have no choice, Leah. This is what's best for us, he said, his voice cracking. Her mother nodded silently, tears sliding down her cheeks. Leah bit her lip, holding back another sob. She knew what this meant. It meant stability, financial relief. It meant a new life, but it wasn't the life she wanted. Asterisk, asterisk. Jason paced back and forth in his room, his mind filled with anger and frustration. He had just returned from his father's office where he had been given the good news. You're serious? Jason yelled, throwing his arms up in the air. You're going to marry me off to some random girl? It's already settled, Mr. Wellington said calmly, his gaze never wavering. You will marry her. I expect you to meet her tomorrow." Jason clenched his fists, his chest tightening. He had always had freedom to do what he wanted, to live on his own terms. And now, that was being taken away from him. A girl he didn't even know, and he had no say in the matter. "What's her name?" Jason asked finally, his voice hoarse. Leah Morrison," his father said, a smile tugging at his lips. "You'll meet her soon enough. And remember, Jason, this is not up for negotiation." Jason turned and stormed out of the room. He needed to think, needed to figure out a way to get out of this. But deep down, he knew his father, knew that when he made a decision, there was no changing it. That night, as Jason lay in his bed staring up at the ceiling, he realized his life was about to take a turn he wasn't ready for. The following day dawned gray and dreary, matching Leah's mood as she stood in front of the mirror, brushing her hair absently. She could hear her mother bustling in the kitchen, but the usual warmth of their home felt absent. It was as if an invisible weight had settled over every corner of the apartment. She sighed, her heart heavy as she thought about the meeting set for today. She would be meeting the man she was supposed to marry, a stranger. Leah could scarcely wrap her mind around it, and every part of her screamed for a way out, but there was none. "Leah, are you ready?" her mother called from the doorway, her voice unusually soft. Leah forced a smile she didn't feel and nodded, her fingers tightening around her hairbrush. "Yes, Mom, I'll be out in a minute." She turned back to the mirror, taking one last look at her reflection. She looked pale, her eyes puffy from lack of sleep. No amount of makeup could hide the anxiety etched across her features. Downstairs, her parents waited, their expressions as tense as hers. The drive to the Wellington mansion was made in silence, Leah's heart pounding in her chest. She watched as the scenery changed, modest apartment blocks giving way to large estates, with manicured lawns and opulent driveways. The change was intimidating. When they arrived, Leah stared up at the Wellington mansion, a towering structure of stone and glass that loomed above her, cold and indifferent. Everything about it screamed money, power. Her father cleared his throat, glancing at her. "Let's go, Leah. We'll get through this," he murmured, but his words offered little comfort. Asterisk. Inside the mansion, Jason was pacing back and forth in the grand hall, his jaw clenched as his father watched him, an amused expression on his face. "You'll wear out the carpet if you keep that up," Mr. Wellington said dryly, his eyes following his son's agitated movements. Jason shot him an icy glare. "I still don't understand why you're doing this. You know it's not going to work. I'm not just going to change overnight." Mr. Wellington raised an eyebrow, folding his arms. "It's not about changing overnight, Jason. It's about setting a course. You're 26, and you've done nothing but waste your life. It's time to take responsibility. Besides, Leah seems like a lovely girl. I think you could learn a thing or two from her." Jason rolled his eyes, his frustration boiling just beneath the surface. "Oh, perfect. Just what I need, a lovely girl to teach me how to be a good little boy." His father's expression hardened, his patience clearly waning. "Enough, Jason. You will meet her and you will be respectful. I will not tolerate any more of your foolish behavior." Before Jason could reply, the butler appeared, announcing the arrival of the Morrisons. Jason let out a sigh, rubbing a hand over his face. This was really happening. There was no backing out now. Asterisk. Leah stepped into the grand entryway, her breath catching as she took in the opulence around her. The towering ceilings, the sparkling chandelier above, the walls adorned with expensive artwork. It was all so overwhelming. Her parents stood by her, looking equally out of place, their eyes darting around the room with a mixture of awe and discomfort. "Welcome," Mr. Wellington said, stepping forward with a smile that seemed genuine enough, though Leah couldn't help but feel wary of him. His presence was commanding, and his eyes held an intensity that made her feel small. "Thank you for having us," her father replied politely, shaking hands with Mr. Wellington. Leah felt her mother's gentle nudge, and she stepped forward as well, managing a polite nod. Mr. Wellington smiled at her, his gaze assessing. "You must be Leah. It's a pleasure to finally meet you." Leah forced herself to smile, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's nice to meet you too." Before she could say more, she heard a sigh from behind Mr. Wellington, and her eyes shifted to meet Jason's for the first time. He stood there, his posture casual, but his expression anything but friendly. He looked as unhappy to be there as she was, if not more. "Jason, this is Leah," Mr. Wellington said, gesturing towards her, "and these are her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Morrison." Jason's eyes flicked over to Leah, then to her parents. He nodded, though there was no warmth in his gaze. "Hello?" he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Leah nodded back, unsure what to say. The silence that settled between them was awkward, and she felt her cheeks flushing. Her parents were watching anxiously, her mother giving her a small, encouraging smile that did little to ease the knot of anxiety in her chest. "Why don't we all sit down for tea?" Mr. Wellington suggested, clapping his hands together. "We have a lot to discuss." Asterisk, asterisk. The tea was served in a drawing room that looked like something out of a historical drama, complete with antique furniture and fine china. Leah sat across from Jason, their parents flanking them on either side. The conversation was stilted, filled with pleasantries that felt painfully forced. Leah sipped her tea, her eyes flicking to Jason occasionally. He seemed disinterested, his gaze wandering around the room, barely participating in the conversation. She couldn't blame him. She felt the same. This was absurd. Two strangers being pushed into something they didn't want, just to appease the demands of others. Finally, Mr. Wellington set his cup down and cleared his throat. "Now, I understand this is not a typical situation," he began, his eyes moving between Leah and Jason, "but I believe it is an opportunity for both of you. You both come from different worlds, yes, but I think you could complement each other well." Jason let out a soft scoff, shaking his head. "This isn't a merger, Dad. You can't just put two people together and expect it to work." Mr. Wellington's jaw tightened, his gaze sharpening. "You will make it work, Jason. Both of you will. There's too much at stake here." Leah looked down at her hands, her heart pounding. She didn't want this. None of it. But her parents were looking at her, their eyes pleading. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "This is what's best for us." She closed her eyes briefly, trying to steady herself. Mr. Wellington turned to Leah, his expression softening slightly. "Leah, I understand this is overwhelming, but I promise you we will do everything we can to make sure you're comfortable. You'll have all the support you need." Leah forced herself to meet his gaze, nodding slowly. "Thank you, Mr. Wellington." "Please call me Richard," he said with a smile. Jason rolled his eyes, muttering under his breath. Leah caught the words ridiculous and charade, and her stomach twisted. She knew he didn't want this any more than she did, and she couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for him. They were both trapped. "Why don't you two take a walk in the garden?" Mrs. Morrison suggested suddenly, her voice a little too bright. "It would be nice for you to get to know each other a bit." Leah's eyes widened, and she glanced at Jason, who looked equally taken aback. He opened his mouth to protest, but a sharp look from his father silenced him. He let out a resigned sigh and stood up, gesturing towards the door. "Fine, let's go," he said, his tone laced with annoyance. Leah stood up as well, her heart pounding. She followed him out of the room, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on her. As they stepped out into the garden, the air felt cooler, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the perfectly trimmed hedges. Jason walked ahead of her, his hands shoved into his pockets, his steps brisk. "Look," Jason said after a few moments, turning to face her, his expression serious. "I'm going to be honest with you. I don't want this, and I'm pretty sure you don't either." Leah stopped, meeting his gaze. There was frustration in his eyes, but also a hint of something else, something almost vulnerable. She nodded. "You're right. I don't want this at all." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Then let's make a deal. We'll play along, make our parents happy, but we'll keep out of each other's way as much as possible. We can pretend, but that's it. No expectations, no strings." Leah considered his words, a sense of relief washing over her. At least they were on the same page. She nodded slowly. "Okay, I can do that." Jason studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good, then we have an understanding." He turned away, looking out over the garden, his shoulders tense. "This whole thing is ridiculous, but if we're stuck in it, we might as well make it bearable." Leah followed his gaze, her heart feeling heavy. This wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, marrying a stranger, living in a gilded cage. But for her family's sake, she would do it. She had no choice. As they stood there, a silence settled between them, filled with unspoken fears and reluctant acceptance. And in that moment, Leah realized just how much her life was about to change and how powerless she was to stop it. The day ended with the signing of documents. Leah felt numb as she watched her father shake hands with Mr. Wellington, sealing her fate. Jason stood beside her, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on a point far away. Their engagement was official, and soon they would be husband and wife. "Congratulations," Mr. Wellington said, smiling at them both. "I believe this will be the start of something great." Leah forced a smile, her heart sinking. She glanced at Jason, who gave her a barely perceptible nod, an unspoken promise that they would face this together, even if they were strangers. The arrangements were made quickly. The wedding would be small and private, just family and a few close friends. Leah knew she had little time left before her life as she knew it would be gone forever. As she climbed into her parents' car, she looked back at the mansion, its towering silhouette dark against the evening sky. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the dread refused to fade. This was her future now, and she would have to find a way to survive it. Asterisk, asterisk. Back at the Wellington mansion, Jason stood in his room, staring out the window, watching the Morrisons' car drive away. His father's voice echoed in his mind. "This is what's best for you." Jason clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists. He didn't believe that, not for 1 second. And as he stood there, he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning of a story that neither he nor Leah wanted to be part of. But they had no choice. Asterisk, asterisk. The door to Jason's room opened suddenly, and his father stepped in, a satisfied smile on his face. "You did well today, Jason," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Jason turned to face him, his expression cold. "I'm only doing this because you left me no choice." Mr. Wellington's smile widened. "You'll thank me one day, son. You'll see." Jason said nothing, turning back to the window, his heart heavy with resentment. And somewhere deep down, he knew that this was only the beginning of a battle between what they wanted and what was expected of them. And he wasn't sure who would win. The cliffhanger of uncertainty hung over him just as it did over Leah. To be continued